My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm the president of the Public Policy Institute of California. And it's my honor to welcome all of you here today to the Bechtel Conference Center for this important discussion about California's future, and in particular the outlook for pension reform in the state. The event is part of our 2012 speaker series on California's future, and for that I would like to especially thank the sponsors of the series who've underwritten our support: the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, the Pacific Life Foundation, Southern California Edison, the Stewart Foundation, Union Bank, and our knowledge partner, McKinsey & Company. The series is also funded by donations to PPIC's Donors Circle, and we thank those individual donors as well. I'd like to acknowledge that two of our board members are in attendance today: Gary Hart, who is our board chair, and Donna Lucas, who is a member of our board, both here. Gary and Donna, it's a pleasure to see you. And of course, a number of members of our staff, so I hope you have an opportunity to visit with them. Before we begin, two housekeeping items. First, before you leave today, there is a survey for you to answer. So, as being the Institute's pollster, I would ask you to complete the surveys if you want to leave today. No, seriously. Before you leave today, I meant. Okay. And we do pay attention to those surveys, and we learn from them how to improve on what we're doing. So we look forward to hearing from you on that. And the second thing, which is something I will need to remind myself to do because it already went off when I was speaking in the office with my colleagues who you'll meet briefly, is to please turn off your cell phone, like I'm going to do right now. Because, I'm sure you all have wonderful ringtones and things like that, but we'll take a rest from the cell phones. Okay, so first it's my honor to introduce State Controller John Chiang, who will be here discussing public pensions and how this topic relates to California's debt burden and the fiscal future. And then, of course, we will be joined on stage, the Controller and myself, with San Jose Mayor Chuck Reed and Assembly Member Michael Allen. So we're hoping to do that in just a few minutes and to have that portion of the program end at a time that you can ask some questions. I'm delighted that so many people are here today. I'm sure that you have things on your minds, and we will get to some of your questions and try to get to as many as possible before 1:30, which is when this program will end. So it's my pleasure to introduce our State Controller, first elected to serve as Controller in 2006. He served 2 terms on the State Board of Equalization and also worked on the staff of Senator Barbara Boxer. It's been a while, John, since I've seen you. It's a pleasure always to have you in a PPIC program, and appreciate your time and interest in our work, and look forward to hearing from you today. Thanks.
Mark, thank you for the invitation to join all of you. I'm absolutely delighted to share a few moments with you. Mark asked me to provide a perspective this afternoon about the impact of public pensions and the state's fiscal condition. Let me take a historical perspective. What a difference a decade makes, or technically 12 years. We wouldn't be having this discussion if it was 12 years ago. The state plans were 100% funded. The school plan was 100% funded. Instead of the number one polling question or concern for adults today, are their kids being afforded the same opportunities that our generation has? And I do speak of our generation. I'm part of the baby boom generation. I qualified for AARP a couple months ago. You had 20-year-olds, kids in college, some of the kids that I used to coach in basketball, talking about being multimillionaires by the time they were 30 because of what was transpiring in the public equities markets. We saw what happened with the dot-com bubble, and then we subsequently saw the dot-com bust. And it has had tremendous consequences. It was also a long time To give you a perspective, as Mark mentioned, I served on the Board of Equalization, and because the valuations of my Apple stock had approached $2,000, I had to sell Apple at $37 a share. I can't tell you how painful that is. So we have today multiple pressure points, and this needs to be added to the context of the public pension discussion. So there's contributions that both plans make, or the state makes. So today we're putting in about $3.7 billion for CalPERS, a little over half of that from general funds, and we put in over $8 billion for the CalSTRS contributions. That is tied to the fact, and we have to remember, this is the most important fact from my perspective as the state's chief fiscal officer. At the end of the day, you have to pay your bills. And at the end of the day, I run the state's cash. The key point that continually gets lost, and all of us have to have a laser-like focus on in this state, is that California has been operating in cash deficit since July 13th, 2007. So if you think about that timing, it is after the foreclosure crisis began in California and before the national recession was officially declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research. So in part because of economic perspective, but also in large part because of failed management by our budgeteers to get our numbers done correctly. And so that is something that we all collectively and individually need to address through this issue and other issues going forward. Now, we need to make sure that their lessons are learned. One of the things that we have improved dramatically at CalPERS and CalSTRS is transparency and accountability. It was a very, very different world. Obviously, we had issues with prior leadership. There were issues still to be addressed regarding corruption and other things. But some of the things that get lost oftentimes in cycles, and what was missed not only by institutional investors, but frankly all of us with the bubble bursting, was risk management. And so I remember a lot of the exercises that my colleagues and I and my predecessors would engage in as to what factors we would value, how much we would value them, and use that as to a determination for asset allocation. I think one of the things we need to go forward as the economy picks up, and we don't know if it's a sustainable pickup in the economy, not only California, but nationally, is whether we will be consistent and continually reinforce those risk management practices, especially the new tools that are being used by each of the authorities. Second, what do we do in regards to asset allocation? Historically, the big diversifier, the most important investment decision we made was asset allocation. But the returns in 2008 across asset classes identified the inherent flaws and fallacies by believing that we were going to sustain and grow our portfolio even in devastating times. And it is a problem that we will continue to experience as we witness a material change in the world. That's also a material consideration in the 21st century. It was easier in our generation when America was the preeminent world's economic and military superpower, which we still are, but things are different. For quite a bit of my lifespan, America was the world's sole economic superpower. And when we're 40% of the world's GDP, we would have a better sense, we would have home field advantage as to what would transpire in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our country. Now we are dealing in an area on turfs that are much more difficult to understand, to comprehend, to invest, and we don't have the tactical and strategic advantages that we do when we invest in the United States. So there are challenges that we're going to have to address going forward. And so, in addition, we have to react. So we're also trying to change the playing fields. So at CalPERS, CalSTRS, trying to reduce some of our investments with some of our better performers to make sure that we reduce the fees that we pay out so that we have a better sense of providing equity and alignment of interests. Now, with this recent pension plan, I just want to talk about some of the water cooler talk at CalPERS because a lot of it doesn't get discussed in the media. It involves great detail. But let me tell you the two areas of reform that really excites the staff at CalPERS in my conversations. Number one, the retroactive pay increases. We knew that we were never going to be able to cover those areas when there was never contributions made. So I think that was an important act symbol that we were really going to try to cleanse the system, to improve the system. And secondly, sort of leveling out the playing field by putting in retirement formula caps. Now, we know it doesn't apply to a whole host of charter cities, but if we can establish a playing field where you don't have certain competitiveness issues, where some cities are ramping up the remuneration, the compensation, the other types of pay packages, we have an ability at least to try to flatten what's happening in the economy, try to control some of the market forces that frankly led to the escalation of compensation packages that we couldn't pay for. So those are two critical developments that we need to be involved in the conversation. Obviously, a major issue that's going to go forward, and I'll leave it up to our panel discussion because we have Chuck here, is how do we negotiate any additional changes? Because we have some of the changes that could be made legislatively, but there are additional issues that have huge litigation risks. And so we may be involved in significant action that may or may not be beneficial. So the better alternative is to get people to the bargaining table to address these issues in a sound, sustainable fashion. So with that, I'll end these comments, and then we'll go to the panel.
On the end here is Mayor Reed from San Jose, who has certainly provided leadership at the local level. In the middle, we have Michael Allen, Assembly member, who has been very instrumental in the work that the legislature did in pension reform this year and will be going forward. And of course, we have the controller. And let's start our discussion today by Chuck with you. And let's talk about what you think of the changes that have occurred at the state and local level in pensions recently.
I read a lot of newspaper editorials about what happened in the state legislature, and it looked like they were working through the thesaurus to come up with different ways to say small. So that doesn't mean it's insignificant, because I think what the state did is a significant step. In fact, some people would say it was a miraculous step to get the legislature to reach an agreement, send it to the governor, and get it signed. So it was a significant step, but when you measure it against the size of the problem, and whether you do that in discounted to present value dollars or gross up the dollars and compare that, you know, it's a 5 to 10% of the problem kind of a solution. Well, it may only be small, but you have to start, and that first step is really important. And I think it has set the stage for what the government, or what the governor said, is more work needs to be done. And I think that's certainly true, but it's always a big plus to get something out of the legislature that addresses a problem, a difficult, complicated problem. And so it was a good thing, significant thing, but we're not done.
Michael.
Thank you. It was very difficult. When the governor came out with his 12-point proposal, I was a supporter of that proposal. We held 6 public hearings. We took testimony from most of the cities, from public employee unions, from taxpayer groups. And one of the things that I noticed almost immediately was that there was a lot of commonality and interest, that everyone agreed that we wanted a sustainable system, but that definition of what constituted sustainability was made very difficult by the fact that there's been a huge argument over the facts, over what is an appropriate rate of return for pension systems to build in, or what is the accrued liability. So going forward, working with the governor, even the governor's own thinking changed over time. I know that one thing that I was very much in favor of trying to build into the pension reform was the possibility of a hybrid system. We do have an existing hybrid system with the STIR system. A hybrid is essentially where not only do you have a defined benefit plan, but you have a defined contribution plan. So I think most of you know that with a defined benefit plan, most of the risk of meeting the returns falls on the employer. With a defined contribution plan, you have more risk taken over by the employee. So one of the things I see going forward is that we need to be looking at those models. One of the things I'm concerned about is that we did a very good job of putting a hard cap on compensable compensation to bring future pensions down, which is a good thing. But there's also a lot of worry about the fact that local government and the state, we hire a lot of professionals, scientists, academics, people who are really highly compensated. And there's a concern that with that, having that hard cap, unless we have some way of maybe through a defined contribution plan of being able to supplement it, that we're not going to be competitive. Although there might be other ways through compensation to correct it. But it was difficult, and what was being relayed by the mayor was so true. I would go to editorial boards and talk to editorial boards, and there was just like a snort of disbelief that the legislature was going to be able to move on this at all. I think one of the most heartening things that I can share with you, some optimism, is that when we finally brought the compromise proposal forward, we almost had unanimous support from both parties in the Senate. Over 2/3 of the Republican Party, as well as my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle, voted for it. So it was a rare show of bipartisan support that maybe it is just the beginning, but at least there was a feeling that it was something that we could do together. And I know that one of the themes that I hear a lot about government is the question, well, is California governable? So I think every time that we can take a step towards sanity and working through our problems together is something that instills confidence that we can be part of the solution and work together with the public and other public officials and our local government folks to fashion something that works.
John?
I thought the accomplishments were significant, not to saying that there's work yet to be done. We still have considerable work to be done, but as Michael articulated, obviously we need to get a better underlying discussion as to the range, especially the range of values, the range of the financial ratios, the investment returns, so that it's out in public, easily discussed, easily understood, and we can fashion better solutions.
Thank you. Well, I want to point out that each of you has shown courage on this issue in different ways. John, you're in your position, you're the one who has to tell people what the reality is about whether you have enough cash to do something and how much money you have to spend on things. And you've been very forthright and courageous about that. I know how hard that is because in my organization, I'm the one who has to tell people we don't have money for this or that. So that's a big deal. Michael, you come from a labor background. You were at SEIU for years. Not easy for somebody who's elected to the legislature with a background in labor to say we got to do something about public employee pensions. So I'd certainly give you credit for that. And Chuck, really before people at the state level were thinking about this issue, you were grappling with it at the local level, and I can imagine that would be not much fun at various times.
Fun is not a word I associate with this topic.
Yeah, or probably with being mayor, for that matter, but you showed great courage. So we talked in generalities the first round. What one change that's been made in the last year, either at the state or local level, do you think is the biggest, most important change?
The idea of the normal costs and the equal sharing of the burden.
Mm.
You know, I would agree with that, with the proviso that I think that the further we get into this, there's going to be lots of discussion about cost. You know, is it your normal cost of contributions that you share, or do you go deeper into what that true cost is, which has lots of implications for how much it is and who pays for it?
Mm-hmm.
I think the principle that there should be a 50-50 sharing of the costs is a really an important principle, even though it doesn't look like the employees are actually going to pay 50% in some cases. But the principle is an important starting place for trying to figure out how do you be fair to everybody and how do you have a sustainable system. You do come back to, look, there ought to be an equal sharing of the cost of this. So I think that's really important that the state establish that. It's one of the things we've tried to do in San Jose as well.
But it also leads to second point, because it is a concern that has been articulated by a few, you do have two tiers. And so you have costs normalized that are going to be, in some cases, most cases equally shared, in some instances not. But then you have people who aren't getting the same benefits. So there are already pension pressure points in the application among those who are working.
So, looking forward, what is the biggest piece of unfinished business in pension reform? The one thing that needs to get done that hasn't been done yet?
I think if you start with the assumption that you're going to solve the problem, which is a big leap, actually, that you're going to solve the problem, and you want to solve that problem by doing two things: making sure that people get paid what they have earned, and that government can provide services to the taxpayers. Once you sort of get there, you realize that these benefits cost too much. Because the employees, if you have a 50-50 sharing principle, the government can't afford half, and the employees can't afford half. And so that leads you inevitably to the fact that you have to deal with current employees, future accruals. And there's a very narrow range of solutions, and that one is always central at being able to do all of these things. And that's the important piece that the state legislation touched on a little bit by making people pay more. But making people pay more is not a solution to the problem, because the employees cannot afford to pay the full cost or half of the cost of the benefits. They're really, really expensive.
To me, I think probably the biggest issue that is going to be determinative of moving forward on this is the whole doctrine in California of vesting. The whole idea that in the private sector, when there's changes to retirement systems, bankruptcy, there isn't a vesting doctrine. In the public sector in California, we do have a vesting doctrine. I'm very interested. We have litigation pending, and then we have the interface between the federal bankruptcy courts and that law, and how it's going to interact with the current state of the law in California. So to me, the way I express it, especially when I talk to public employee unions and also to taxpayers, is that to me it's an issue that, with whether you're talking about Social Security or pensions, you're talking about this intergenerational compact where you're trying to keep your promises to one generation you made, but there's going to be a whole need for services and service providers into the future, and how can you be fair to both? So to me, this whole idea of how you deal with the reforms and at the same time keep promises that might not be susceptible to keeping because of the cost is going to be the biggest challenge. And to me, I think that some of this is going to end up playing out, whether it's in the state courts or through federal bankruptcy court, that's going to give us some guidance, and then a need for further legislation and clarification as we go forward.
Yeah, and picking up on Michael's last point, in addition, tying that to sustainability. How do we get the parties that are involved to agree as to what's sustainable, what's contributions when you have good years, and especially when you have bad years? What will suffice in terms of the contributions all parties have to make? What's the acceptable rate of return, so that we can get it out of the public debate area and really focus on the technical aspects of investments?
Terrific. So, I've read a lot of reports on pensions, both for California and nationwide. And the one thing that I've noticed in all the reports is the unfunded liability piece, and in particular the unfunded liability around healthcare costs for retirees. I'm wondering if each of you could discuss that. We've had pension reform that is supposed to be dealing with some of the underlying liability, but everything that I've heard and read about suggests that there's a lot more unfunded liability than we've dealt with currently. What are your thoughts about the level of unfunded liability that we have and what to do about it?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. I can tell you that when we met as a conference committee, this was a subject that was brought up repeatedly, but with the state has already taken fairly major significant steps forward to start having the employees pay much more toward their share of the retiree health care, but also that the vesting, in terms of how long you actually have to work to be able to earn it, has been a big subject of concern. And I think you also have to understand that the problem for the state is a lot different than for local government, because our amount of personnel as a percentage of our budget is much lower than local government. But to me, I think one of the problems we had dealing with it on the conference committee level, and I can just tell you from personal experience, is that so many of the local governments, whether it's cities or counties, have these discrete idiosyncratic deals that have been cut that have a history to them for retiree health care. And to unwind them, to try to do it at the state level, where we're going to end up not wreaking damage on what the financial ecology was to put those together, was something that we need to have a lot of more discussion with the League of Cities and CSAC regarding. Because I'll give you a very concrete example. For years, when I bargained with Sonoma County, at one time the healthcare costs were 1%, 2%, 3% of benefits. Then over the years, it became higher and higher and higher as a percent of payroll. And essentially, the answer I'd get about putting money away for it was, we'll worry about it when we get there. And what happened is Sonoma County eventually had to really break its covenant with its retirees and employees to structure something that they felt was sustainable. Conversely, the city of Santa Rosa demanded that if we were going to provide some sort of health care coverage for retired employees, that we set it up so there was 100% actuarially funded from the beginning. And that system, it's not as generous as what the county has, but it's 100% bulletproof in terms of the money is there, and the folks know that the benefit is available to them. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest things we do, is not try to imagine from Sacramento what's going to work for retiree health care. Work really closely with our partners in local government to give them the tools they need as they negotiate individually around their retiree health care plans.
So Michael talked about the local government aspect. I'll talk about the state aspect. So I did the GASB study under GASB Rules 43 and 45 in 2007. So I did it 2 years earlier than required under the accounting standards rules. The first survey we did identified, if we did it on a pay-go basis, that the state's obligation over a 30-year window would be $47.88 billion. Subsequent studies had to go up to 48, 51, 59, and the last study we did earlier this year was $62.2 billion. So in a 5-year span, our obligation went up from 47.88 to $62.2 billion. One of the things that we did it early because we wanted to give Governor Schwarzenegger and the legislature back then an opportunity. The former governor, put in place a study group to review it, but obviously with the deterioration quickly of the state's finances, they didn't take the number one recommendation, was to pre-fund. We were already financially challenged. If you remember, later that year, I had to issue IOUs to keep California from turning into Greece and going insolvent on our state's debt. But that's something we need the legislature and the current governor to really focus on to pay down our obligations. Secondly, we have to use best practices in place. We don't do as aggressively as we should be simple things such as disease prevention and wellness programs. So my office currently is doing a pilot study on disease prevention and wellness. We had anticipated that 60% of my eligible staff members would participate. We actually have 90% participation rate. I got a note from one of my staff members last week who indicated, "Thank you for doing this disease prevention program. I identified that I'm pre-diabetic." The cost to all of us as taxpayers for that, if he becomes diabetic, is $2,100 increase in costs. If it goes full-blown and he has heart disease, the cost to us taxpayers is $21,000. So it's these types of programs that we're really going to have to engage in to try to change the long-term OPEB numbers.
I think the OPEB, especially the healthcare piece, is going to be the fastest growing element, although smaller in many instances than the pension obligation. In San Jose, we have about a $3.5 billion unfunded liabilities for our two independent pension plans, and they're independent from the city. I don't get to make the rules. So we have about $3.5 billion of unfunded liabilities. About half of that is healthcare. The other half is pensions. In San Jose, we have the principle in place where the employees pay half and the city pays half of the cost of retiree health care. Well, that went into place about 1984, so it was before my time. I'm not responsible. For years and years and years, the employees paid about 1%. City paid about 1%. We are now at a point where our employees, some of them are paying 10% out of their paycheck, and they're going to be paying soon 15% out of their paycheck. The city's also paying 15%. So the fact that we're paying for it, we're beginning to pre-fund it, is a huge expense to the employees and a huge expense to the city. But if we don't pre-fund it, we will go the way of Vallejo and Stockton, and it'll get handled in a bankruptcy court. And that's not good news for the employees.
So, as we think about these unfunded liabilities, and John alluded to this earlier, this puts tremendous pressures on those working in the pension world to find the best investments and also to set the investment rates in a place that would seem to be sustainable. And I'm wondering how much you think has been done and could be done and what should be done in the area of both identifying best practices around investments and in setting investment returns in a world in which, as John said, you know, it's becoming harder and harder to find your way to decent investment returns. But in a world in which the people who are dealing with pensions are looking out at this big liability and have to figure out how to make some money over the course of 20 to 30 years. How do you deal with this?
Well, I try to avoid the arguments about assumed rate of returns and investment rate of returns, because that's an argument that can go on forever, because the difficulty with predicting the future is it keeps changing. That's
But don't you
Yogi
have
Berra.
to at least have some sense about what investment return to expect?
Well, you do.
Make predictions?
You do, but you know that's an argument that never ends.
Okay.
And so I just say, fine, if it's going to be 7.5%, that's what the board say it is. That's an optimistic scenario, because less than 50 probability of reaching that scenario. But given that rate of return, I'm still looking at a $3.5 billion unfunded liability, and my investment return on the two plans that we have in San Jose since their inception has been 8%. So they've earned 8%, and we still have a $3.5 billion unfunded liability. So you can argue about the rate of return, but fundamentally the problem is it doesn't change the cost of the benefit. And you can't solve the problem of really expensive benefits by assumption changes. You can delay, you can disguise, you can defer, but it doesn't pay for the benefit. The benefits cost whatever they cost. When people retire, they get whatever they're entitled to, and you've got to pay it. So it's a very interesting argument about the rate of return assumptions, but what we should be doing, I think, is trying to bracket the optimistic scenario and the pessimistic scenario and trying to plan for both eventualities. Typically, we have just taken a scenario. We've got a rate of return, and all these decisions get made based on that, and sometimes it's not the right rate of return. As we learned historically, sometimes you can't do it.
I would answer slightly differently. You know, I remember at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union that there became this kind of phrase about the end of history, and I thought it was nonsensical. And this whole thing that we've been grappling with for the last few years about whether we have a new normal, I don't think we know what normal is yet, because we're coming out of whether you would want to call it the Great Recession or a Depression. It's been historically a whole generation of us did not experience what our grandparents experienced. And so I know personally that I do find it attractive to maybe be a little bit more conservative about the rate of assumption and require more contributions from the employer's employees. Yet at the same time, I'm very much aware that if we did that, it has a huge repercussion for the state and local government when we're trying to help them recover and not put more cities and municipalities and special districts into bankruptcy. I also was a big supporter of the governor's proposal for improve governance and trying to get more people on the panels who had the expertise that would help with the investment portfolio. But to me, it's a really difficult problem that I'm still grappling with in terms of what's the right approach.
Yeah, and so Michael said what, frankly, a lot of my colleagues on both CalPERS and CalSTRS think, and I want to take an opportunity to introduce our great chair, the president of our board, Rob Fechner from CalPERS, and Paul Rosensteel, who's a colleague of mine on CalSTRS. We think about this every time we get together. We think about what the appropriate discount rate should be. But then, and so a lot of us would like to de-risk our portfolio, but we have to understand what it does to contributions, especially for local government. And my office today is conducting nearly 399 audits of redevelopment agencies. Many of them are close to the margin of going off the fiscal cliff. And so we have to add something that a lot of people don't think about. If we change the discount rate, do we create a financial contagion in the state of California, which we all need to avoid? So it is a delicate balancing act, and frankly, a discussion that needs to be probed in greater depth before all of us engage and go forward.
So I'm going to pick up on something that Michael said, which involved the pension boards. I mean, the state, at the local level, at the state level, there are pension boards everywhere. The world of finance has gotten so complicated. And I know that there are some very talented people on the pension boards. But to what degree should we be, should the state be playing a role, or who should be playing a role in determining the type of expertise that we might need on pension boards today to navigate through these difficult challenges of the pension expenses in one place and the investments, the long-term investments to pay for these things?
Well, I know personally that the part of the reason why we didn't implement the governor's proposal on the governance is that the more we got into it, the more we felt that we need to have more of discussion with the actual retirement systems plus local government before we actually welded something into the Constitution, much less do it by statute. And so to me, that kind of goes back to the category of unfinished business, because the one thing I've learned is that when you're dealing with this sort of things regarding governance and what's appropriate and what kind of expertise you need, you want to get as many views as possible and look at the best possible practices from all over before you make any changes.
Have you seen any from elsewhere that you think California could use?
Not yet.
Anybody else have
Well,
any
there's
ideas
alternative
about
models.
governance?
Not necessarily that I would advocate it, but you have an investment authority and you have a benefits authority, right? Because those are two material questions you have to address if you're sitting on an institutional investor board. And so that's a model that's different than what we have in California.
I think it's important to bring in outside expertise, people who are independent, who don't have a conflict of interest. We tried to do that in San Jose by adding some people to our two retirement boards.
And what type of conflict of interest do you worry about the most on these boards?
Well, I just speak to San Jose, and I know that it's been similar in some other cities, but a few years ago in San Jose, we had council members sitting on the board, and I never wanted to be on that board. I never wanted to be that council member because I could never figure out how am I going to handle the cognitive dissonance of being a council member 1 minute, trying to save money for my general fund, and not wanting to pay into a retirement fund any more than I had to, and then go over and be a retirement board person where my job was to make sure the people got paid what they were earned, and so I want to have higher contribution rates. And then at the same time, I've got to run for election, and I've got to face the people, the unions who are engaged in political activity. So I've got 3 different personas inside one head, and I didn't think I could handle that. And so we've taken council members off of the boards. We've added in some outside people who don't have that conflict. And then we also have, still do have, people who are drawing from the plan on the boards, people who represent the unions on the boards, and they have a different interest.
Sure.
And even though we say, look, you're fiduciaries, you're to look out for the interests of the plan, people bring their personalities, they bring their interests, they bring their conflicts with them. And I think you get some bad decisions because of the inherent instability of a defined benefit plan, where if you fully fund the benefit, it costs a lot of money. Whereas if you just change the assumptions, It doesn't cost so much, at least in the short run, and we've seen that play out in places like San Diego and in San Jose, where you're sitting there on the board and you think, wow, if I vote to change the assumed rate of return, that means my contribution is going to go up, or the people I represent's contribution is going to go up. So you just have these inherent conflicts. Now, sometimes it's impossible to have people who don't have a conflict. I understand that. But I think it's good to have independent outside people to help sort of leaven out the internal conflicts that people bring as they represent unions and they represent employees or they represent elected officials.
So I heard the word bankruptcy came up once. I also heard the term fiscal cliff. That made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But you know, it's there. That's part of the reality that we're dealing with. And certainly we've had bankruptcies in California recently. Are we going to have bankruptcies at local government in California around the issues of pensions in the next few years?
Well, you know, I'll just take a shot at that from the standpoint that I think inherently it's the question would infer that it's solely the result of pensions that are driving the cities into
Oh, I
bankruptcy.
know there are other issues.
Right. So to me, I think that at least with some of the economic data we're seeing is that I don't think it's going to be a widespread contagion of folks going into bankruptcy. I mean, the district I presently represent has Vallejo in it, and I saw how painful bankruptcy was for them and how many unforeseen circumstances there are to going into bankruptcy. So I don't think that cities are going to rush pell-mell into bankruptcy just to avoid their pension obligations. So I don't see it as being a contagion. But you know, I do see that there's a lot of cities. John mentioned the redevelopment agencies who are getting very near the end of their rope, and we've been all kind of in this pattern of waiting and waiting for Godot, waiting for the recovery, and it's been a very, very weak recovery, pretty much a jobless recovery. So, but I would be really surprised if we see a mass entrance into bankruptcy over the pension issue. At least that's my view from
But do you think there'll be some?
some.
It depends on the resolution of the San Jose case.
Can you explain that for everybody?
Chuck, did you want to explain it? It's in your jurisdiction.
Sure.
I'll explain it. But
And we'll come
I
back
don't
to
want
you,
to step
John.
on your territory.
I think it depends on the answer to the question is, can you affect future accruals of current employees for health care and for pension without going to bankruptcy, which is what we tried to do in San Jose. And if you can't do it except in bankruptcy, then I think we'll see more bankruptcies. Because when you look at what's happened in San Jose and other large cities around the state, we're now paying more than 20% of our general fund out for retirement benefits.
20%.
More than 20%.
More
And
than
it's going to grow for another 10 or 12 years according to our retirement board's actuaries. LA is more than 20%, San Diego is more than 20%. And so I'm using 20% as, look, that's that pain point where cities realize they have to do something. And if the only option is bankruptcy, it will have to be used. Because what's going to happen is if we don't get control over these future accruals, we're going to slide into service level insolvency. We'll have enough money to pay our bills, we just can't afford to provide services. At some point in there, the council is going to look at that and say, our job is to provide services, we're not providing services, we need to deal with our obligations, and one of those obligations happens to be pensions, and the other is health care benefits, and you have the others. But they're such big numbers, you can't ignore them. Although Stockton is trying to ignore the pension part in its bankruptcy, but the bondholders and the bond insurers are not going to let Stockton ignore the pension because it's such a big number. It's just obvious that if you're going to deal with your problems, you look at the big numbers first, and that happens to be a really big number. It happens to be growing very rapidly. And there's a certain amount of pain there that gets created when you cut services year after year after year. The cities eventually say, you know, bankruptcy is our only choice. So if it's not our only choice, I don't think, if people have a choice, they'll use that choice, because I do think bankruptcy is pretty much the last resort. The pain has to be pretty bad before you get there.
And I want to add on, so Michael made a good point. You don't want to follow Vallejo's path. Hopefully we can get to resolution that, as I indicated in my initial comments, because people are wasting tens of millions of dollars in litigation, frankly not using it for essential services or to resolve unfunded pension obligations. Chuck mentioned in bankruptcy, the question is not only if it can occur in bankruptcy, if it can occur at all. And so that will be the determination of the Stockton issue. And then we had to add another wrinkle, because not only is it for municipalities, because we have the California Constitution, so how would it apply at the state level? So there's a lot of issues to be resolved, and that's why, frankly, it's just better resolution at the bargaining table instead of pushing forward solutions that may take forever, and we have the lost time.
So John, do you think we're going to be seeing a lot of bankruptcies or not?
We will start to see more bankruptcies, not necessarily because of the pension issue, right? Because Stockton's more complicated than
Right.
the pension issue.
Sure.
We have to understand, and we have to engage across the board how you have local development, right? Everybody can't be San Francisco or in Los Angeles. Not everybody's Beverly Hills and Santa Monica, depending where you reside. Secondly, I need Michael's assistance because we need the state to participate in trying to prevent these bankruptcies. Right? There's a little bit of resistance. We have to repair the relationship between state government and local government. There is no trust from local government with state government, so they don't want our assistance. And then the additional...
What do you think needs to be repaired?
They don't like the raids. They don't like the change in the rules. The latest example being redevelopment agencies, saying we just took away their economic tool. So frankly, it's an opportunity to reconfigure the financing scheme for the state of California. If you look at our tax structure, our franchise tax authority was created in 1929. Our sales tax authority was created in 1933, and we're in the 21st century. Yeah. And so we have basic arguments that you covered extensively at PPIC. We talk about Texas versus California, and people who do those models and have those discussions have very superficial conversations because Texas has better coverage of their corporate taxes than we do here in California. And then we have these disparate rates, but we need to fully explain all these things so we can get back to levels later on that touch upon pensions.
You know, and John is making a great point, and by using redevelopment as an example, because it was litigation where it actually worked out as the worst possible result for the League of Cities. Worst possible result because the legislature had attempted to create successor agencies. So in a short period of time, to try to unwind this long history of redevelopment agencies and not have it have severe economic repercussions has just been horrible for everyone. And so I think the point that John is stressing, and I would stress it as well, is that if these things can be negotiated out rather than litigated, because be careful what you ask for when you go into the courts.
Yeah, because the unintended consequences on RDA was this. They didn't want the RDAs to go under, right? They wanted a contribution by the RDAs to try to pay some of the other costs, such as education. So it was voluntary, let people make a choice. The league representatives got upset, so they just contested it across the board. They went for it all, and unfortunately, it depends on perspective, they lost, and now we have this tension, and we have an unfolding, which in some parts will be good, but it may expose some real financial hazards in California and exacerbate pension or salary, other types of compensation issues.
I would agree that a negotiated solution is the best solution, but from the city's point of view, we're being told you can't solve this problem at the negotiating table. You cannot sit down with your unions and agree to affect future accruals of current employees. You can't do it. Unconstitutional, vested rights doctrine. We won't talk about it. Which leaves you to back, well, is bankruptcy the only way we can do this? You know, I don't think bankruptcy should be the only way. In fact, I don't think that it couldn't be negotiated, but we're going to have to litigate that and get some answers from the courts, I think, before we're in a position where we really can negotiate with our bargaining units, because the leadership of the unions are in a position of we can't negotiate away a vested right, a vested benefit. It belongs to the individual. The individual is vested in that right. So union leaders are saying, we can't do that. We won't talk to you about that. We're not going to do that. So then we're back to ballot measures and litigation. And I do think that ultimately what's going to happen is we'll have to have a statewide constitutional amendment that clarifies the right of state and local government to affect future accruals for current employees. Because the vested rights doctrine that came out of the case law in California, and we could change the Constitution to answer that question. And I think we'll have to, because we have to be able to deal with those future accruals, such as the private sector is required to do if they're in trouble under a RESA. We need to be able to do the same thing, which guarantees people get paid what they've earned. That's a key part of it. But you have to do something about those future accruals because we can't afford the cost of these benefits.
And you're saying that going to the ballot box is going to be the route for that, or?
I think it will be. We'll have to change the California Constitution, which
Yeah.
would require voter approval.
Yeah.
Or, I would try an additional tack too, though. I would isolate on that vested rights, because if the represented employees get something in return, so it's still very nebulous right now, the sustainability of that plan or something else where you can say they accrued a benefit, then you can have that change, right? So I think we need to fashion some type of solution to have more engagement so that we can get to a better place, so you can have a benefit negotiated at the table, if possible.
Well, you certainly would think that just ordinary people would believe that if you're getting something that guarantees you to be paid, what now is uncertain because of potential for bankruptcy, you're getting something. That sustainability is important to the employees because ultimately it's the employees who get hammered into bankruptcy, or when you run out of money, as other cities have done around the country, the employees are the ones who don't get paid. And so they do have an interest in a sustainable plan, but whether or not that you get something for the negotiated benefit is appropriate trade-off, I think that itself will be litigated.
I've got a million questions, but I'm just going to ask one because I know they've got a million questions too. How much time do we have to solve this problem? Quickly, each of you. A year,
Some levels
2
of
years,
government,
10
there was
years?
no time. San Jose ran out of time.
Okay.
10 years of cutting, we were on the edge of service level insolvency. We had to act, and other cities are reaching at that same point. Why did we have to act? Well, we're over 20% of the general fund, going up for another 10 or 12 years, another 10 years of cutting people. We went from 7,400 employees to 5,400 employees. How far would we be down that line in 10 years? We didn't want to find out. We just reached the point where we had to act, and the pain of acting was less than the pain of not acting, and I think other cities are there.
Okay. John, how much
I
time
don't
does
know how long the state has.
How much time does the state have?
Well, the sooner we resolve this, the better. But so, for instance, we need to make up about 20%. So if we had 3%, if we on top of what our expected rate of return, which is 7.5 at both PERS and STIRS. So actually, I'm just talking about PERS. We added 10.5 for the next decade. We're there. Or if we have 3 years of 20% returns, we're pretty close to where we need to be. But you don't want to leave it up to that. So obviously, you want to cut into your unfunded obligation as quickly as possible.
Do you have a prediction how much time we have?
To me, you just can't look at it from the standpoint of the fact that your retirement funds are funded for X number of years. To me, the sooner we can start inflecting those cost points and bringing them downward, whether it's in pensions or retiree health care, the sooner.
So I'm hearing from each of you that we should be dealing with this immediately.
What I'm saying is we have dealt with it and we're going to continue dealing with it.
Questions?
My name is Vish More. I am a past president of Community Colleges Board of Governors. My question to all of you, I think in my opinion, the political climate needs to be changed in the country. It is changing. But at the same time, it is very difficult for either Democrats or Republican, whatever it is, they must work together. And that's not happening. You can see the whole country, that's an issue. So what I'm suggesting, like one class example I will give you.
Question.
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 Question is, if one party is saying certain people are benefiting, like Mr. Romney is saying 47% of the total people, Mr. Obama is going to get automatic that votes. How can they then have a reform in the country then?
Okay. One answer from one of you. Who wants to take on that question?
I think we get that reform because we're eventually all going to realize that it's in the employee's interest and the government's interest to make sure these plans are sustainable. It's in everybody's interest. And as some of the member has mentioned, there's a lot of disagreement about the facts, and that's certainly true. But fundamentally, it's in everybody's interest to make sure these plans are sustainable.
Let's take a question from this side of the room. Anybody have a question on this side of the room? No? How about this side of the room? Right over here? Okay. Yes?
You said that you think can be the solution to the vested rights issue can be resolved by changing the Constitution. So in your opinion, is the vested rights issue merely a state issue, or how much of it is a federal contract issue that even the state constitution can't be changed to address?
99% of the issue is a California state law issue, and could be changed by putting something in the California Constitution that deals with it. We still have parameters of federal law and federal contracts law to deal with, but there's a great deal that we could do well within the federal law.
And that's because others have a different interpretation of the vested rights?
Well, that's because under federal contract law, you start with what is a contract, and is there a contract? And federal courts tend to be more deferential to the fact that government has obligations for health and safety, and government has to make some decisions. The federal courts have just been more recognized that we have inherent powers that we have to exercise to make those decisions, and the rules are different for evaluating the importance of that decision.
Question from the back of the room. Anybody in the back of the room? Here we go. All the way in the back of the room. Then we'll come back to the front. I know you're
Hi,
anxious to ask
my
a
name's
question.
Clifford Waldeck, and I'm married to a state worker, so it's a very important topic to me here. As we read the news, you always hear about the guy that makes $300,000 a year and gets a $250,000 pension, or somebody who's triple dipping or something like that. But where is the meat of the savings going to actually occur? I mean, what are the most egregious costs? Because I don't think it's the people that we read about in the paper, and I just wonder what your macro and analysis shows.
I think it's a good question, Cliff. Who wants to take that on?
Well, those are all very high-profile examples that make people angry, but the real dollars, is as usual, is in the middle, and the real solutions have to do with making the changes for everybody, not just for the people at the very, very top, because you're not going to save a lot of money even if you eliminate all the pensions for the people at the very top like that. You have to deal with everybody. You know, it's like the middle class makes up the middle. So we have to change the accrual rates for everybody, the future accrual rates. And we need to stretch out the retirement age for everybody. We can't just focus on the people that make the headlines in the newspaper.
It's an important enough question, which I'd like our other two panelists to address that. We'll come back to you. It's okay.
The pension spiking is an outlier issue in terms of cost, but obviously it provides tremendous headline risk, and it misfocuses what actually takes place. Most of the pensions that occur for both CalPERS and CalSTRS are incredibly reasonable. If you're talking about pensions plans for state workers, and obviously it's going to increase with this generation, but less than $38,000. And when you talk about teachers working 23 years and making $2,200 a month for their retiree benefits, and they don't get Social Security, I think people would view that as fair, especially with the way the educational system's changing dramatically today. Addressing placing caps on some of those other management positions, I think is going to have a strong benefit over a period of time.
Michael?
Yeah, and I just think it's important for folks to know that when the conference committee met with the governor and worked through the proposals, there was a strong bias toward trying to protect the low-paid workers, the folks who are not making these large salaries, who are struggling to make their ends meet. And so a lot of our reforms were structured in such a way as to go after the abuses and the things that were troubling the public, but not to try to harm pensions of folks who've worked 25, 30 years for the public, or been a teacher, or just given their life in public service, and to harm them. So I think we try to be very mindful of that while we were trying to effectuate savings going forward and stabilize the system.
So Mark had a question, and then we'll come up to you.
My question is about the macro. I'm Mark Luthier from the San Francisco Foundation. My question is about macroeconomic effects. Most of the solutions are short term of taking current spending, putting it into investment for future obligations. And one of the imbalances in our economy at the moment is we seem to have enough capital. We just don't seem to have enough demand. This will exacerbate that, and I'm just wondering if you think about macroeconomic modeling, what does this mean?
Anybody want to take that on?
Well, at least the way I look at it is that we built our entire economy post-war World War II as a consumer economy, and if we don't have money in the hands of people so they're able to spend it, it's going to be a catastrophe. I mean, a lot of what we looked at also was the beneficial effects of all places in California where we have retirees purchasing goods and services. So I think we were trying to be mindful of that because there's that plus side. Obviously, we don't want to have a society where you work for 30 years and everybody goes on welfare. I don't think so. So it's that balance that we're trying to achieve.
Yes?
Then I'm just going to take a side route from a different perspective, right? Obviously, if you do QE3, it has an impact on your fixed income portfolio. It changes calculations, it changes inflation rate, so that impacts your discount rate. So it has tremendous implications.
There's been no one more anxious here today to ask questions than me than you. And what is your name, sir?
Okay.
What is your name, sir?
My name is Herbert Weiner. I'm a retired social worker from public service.
Thank you.
Now, the first question is, why is it that in this recession...
One question. So it's got to be your give us your best shot. Question mark.
Okay. When is business going to start paying its fair share?
Okay, good question.
Oh boy, that's a big question.
Well, you're the controller.
Yeah, we need fundamental tax reform in the state of California. I alluded to it a little bit earlier. We have this incredibly antiquated system. I think we've made tremendous progress recently when the voters in November of 2010 passed Proposition 25 that provided for majority vote budgeting. Now, it kept the two-thirds requirement for increases in taxes, but what had happened is that in trying to secure the last few votes to pass a budget, you would basically do whatever those last few legislators wanted to. So about 4 years ago, you tell me what year, Mike, 4 or 5 years ago, California, which used to double-weight its sales factor and give a single factor to payroll factor and property factor, created this is corporate tax apportionment methodology. Actually, let me ask this question. How many of you can explain California's corporate tax apportionment methodology formula? Raise your hand.
There's a couple.
One person.
So David, two of you can. Right, so we made a fundamental mistake a couple years ago by making it elective. And so that's one of the things that voters may choose to change with Proposition 39. So while we cut education $3 billion that year over a 3-year period of time, we gave a $3 billion tax break basically to the 18 largest corporations, not because it's of political benefit. It doesn't necessarily create incentives, create business here in California, hire people California, hire property in California. So we need common sense people who are going to design a 21st century system. And so you need 5 great leaders. You need a governor and 4 legislative leaders who are going to say, we're going to bring everybody to the table. We're going to fix California's tax structure and make it work for California going forward.
Anybody
so I
wanna
can't give you
add
time,
anything?
but you need 5 great leaders.
Anybody want to add anything? One last question. Anybody have? Yes?
Hi, my name is Doug DePhillips. You mentioned about how in the late 90s, this wasn't really a discussion because the economy was good and we were getting, lots of revenue into the state. And sort of going off his question about tax reform, has there been any talk about reforming the code to insulate it a bit more from economic swings, so maybe Sacramento doesn't have to focus on Facebook offering as much?
Yeah, we've had quite a few discussions about how to have a more constant stream of revenues to the state. I don't view that as the problem, right? At the end of the day, get in the revenues, but have leadership that understands what's in the best interest. We ought to go back to basic philosophy. If you have a good year, use some of the money in a rainy day fund. Actually, I would do things differently. I'm the oldest child of immigrant parents. So when you don't have any money, you use what money you have to pay down debt. And we owe education tens of billions of dollars today in California. Education community basically has been floating the operation of the state budget. So we all care about education. It's basically the #1 priority. So let's use any excess revenues or design those monies to pay back the current debt, and we're serving multiple purposes.
Thank you, John. I have a comment and a question, so I'm kind of breaking my own rule about asking questions.
As long as they're short.
Yeah. Thank you. And when you all came to my office today, I really didn't know what to expect. We had state and local leaders. We had somebody with a labor background. We had all kinds of possibilities for maybe people weren't going to get along, but you did. And you showed courage in coming here today and expressing the similarities and differences you have in your opinions. What suggestions do you have going forward about how we're going to work these, how people are going to work these problems out? So this is really a process question. How do we get to solutions when we've got parties with very different interests and responsibilities to represent those interests?
Well, I'll tell you, my background has been as a mediator and a negotiator. And what I found is, and I'll give you an example, when I started working on some reform for our state hospital system, the mental hospitals, the initial reaction I got from the Republicans was that this is regarding health care and we have ideological differences. I said, no, it's about safety. And when I got them talking about safety as opposed to health care, suddenly Republicans and Democrats could come together. When we started talking about pensions with the Republicans, it was an ideology about public employee unions versus sustainability and solvency for everybody so that we would free up money for the services that everybody wants in California. And that's how we started making progress on that issue. So sometimes it's the way we approach it, because if you go to those things that people hold dearest and try to attack their ideology or ideas, you get nowhere. But if you can find a commonality that I'll put it this way, with the pension issue, there were some folks I talked to who believed there was absolutely no problem. I tried to talk with the people who believed there was a problem. They might have disagreed about the severity, but they agreed there was a problem and a need to try to work on it to solve it. So, sometimes, like anything in life, you go to where there's at least an agreement that you can begin working out from. And that's where, kind of going to your earlier question, I see hope that whatever your ideology, if you can agree there's a problem, try to get your facts straight, work on mutual interest to make it better for all Californians.
I'm going to leave it with that hopeful comment unless either of you want to add something.
I do.
Yes? Oh, okay.
We need
Go ahead.
the PPIC
Okay.
to help us figure out what the facts are, because if we can get an agreement on some of the facts, then we can begin to establish the basis for moving forward, because right now, as Assemblyman Rivers mentioned, there's a huge disagreement on the facts, and we spend a lot of time arguing about how big is the liability, how big is all these things, and that keeps us from focusing on, okay, we have a problem, here's the defined problem, how do we find the solution?
John, you want to add anything?
Trust. The problem is we don't have trust. I think the change in term limits where people in the assembly now can, instead of serving 6, can serve 12. In the old days, whether you liked them or not, when you had Pete Wilson, Willie Brown, they knew they were going to be there for a while. And so they said, okay, we'll make you give on this issue, you'll get something here. So they really thought about how to be pragmatic and how to make things work. Hopefully with an extension of term limits, the legislators won't have to worry about what am I going to say in 2 years. They'll try to think about how we're going to fix problems and gain the substantive knowledge to actually effectuate it.
Well, John and Michael and Chuck, I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come here and offer very, very valuable perspectives, experience, and information about a critical topic for California's future. To everybody who joined us today, I want to thank you for your interest and your participation, for those of you who asked questions. And for our sponsors, once again, I want to thank you for making this possible. And for all of you, I want to encourage you to continue these conversations with your friends and neighbors and colleagues. Beginning with, right now we have cookies. For all of those of you who've finished your evaluation surveys, no, for everyone, cookies and conversation to continue. Thanks very much for joining us today.